Okay, welcome to this discussion entitled The Unending Israel Palestine War. How did it come to this, and what is to be done? And just to introduce myself, I'm Alan Scott. I teach at the University of New England. We want to look this evening, or my colleagues want to look this evening, at the causes, the context, and possibly some ideas for solutions to the current and long-running conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. This might be the appropriate point at which to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The speakers tonight are, in this order, Professor Howard Brasted, who is Emeritus Professor of History and Islamic Studies at UNE, Dr. Karin von Strokirch, who is Adjunct Lecturer in International Relations, then Graham Maddox, who is Emeritus Professor of Politics, also at UNE, Professor Helen Ware, who is Professor of Peace Studies and had a former career as a diplomat, and then Dr. Tim Battin, who is Honorary Associate with the Australia Institute. Now, all of these people have worked for many years at the university, which has benefited enormously from their contribution, and I have also benefited enormously from their collegiality. So can I first ask Howard to come up to the lectern?
Thank you, Alan. My task has been is to explain the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as best I can, a conflict that, as you know, flared up after Hamas launched a deadly attack on southern Israel on the 7th of October. Such explanation would normally take a series of lectures, and I've been given 10 minutes to try to put into context what is happening and why it is happening. My starting point is that the rather one-sided, uncomplicated story our political leaders and the tabloid press have tended to put out so far fails to explain anything. The context they conjure up is that terrorism is at the heart of everything Hamas does. Since Hamas is categorised as a terrorist organisation, ignoring the fact that it governs Gaza because it won an election in 2006, its actions and its motivations can be understood purely and simply in terms of terrorism. And terrorism requires no explanation. As Richard Pearl, a former advisor of ex-President George Bush, put it, he is a neoconservative, to seek to explain terrorism is tantamount to excusing it. The corollary is that counter-terrorism, which Israel is currently engaged in, therefore needs no excuse and needs no explanation. This was the message that President Bush delivered the world in response to 9/11. That terrorism and those that resort to it will be tracked down and destroyed whatever the cost. Still, US policy 2 decades on, it would appear that the US has given the green light to Israel to do exactly this in the Gaza Strip, irrespective of civilian casualties and irrespective of any humanitarian crisis that may result. Destroying Gaza and the homes of 2.6 Palestinians is presumably okay, is presumably a price that must be paid if Hamas is destroyed in the process. Now, a striking feature of this framework of explanation is its tendency to put Hamas's terrorism, and by extension Palestinian terrorism in general, into a context where all the reasons for it don't have to be considered at all. This is the context. From my position as an historian, context is everything. And the context that makes better sense of what is currently happening in the Middle East is the historical context. What seems conveniently forgotten or ignored in the official narrative is that the events we are watching unfold are just the latest chapter in a long and bitter conflict between Israelis and Palestinians that has been going on throughout my lifetime, in fact, and indeed for over a century now. Beginning in 1918, the 105-year period in question has been punctuated by violent confrontations between them every decade. Unless we forget, the Gaza Strip at the centre of things has been subjected to heavy Israeli bombardment 4 times previously this century alone. The 21st century, 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021. Full-scale invasion by Israel this time around looks rather imminent. There can be no excuse for not taking any of this into account. For the underlying causal issues haven't changed over the years. The root cause of the conflict, as I see it, and very few scholars, when it comes down to it, disagree, Israeli scholars as well, is that Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have been fighting over the same piece of land they both lay claim to. Now, regardless of the rights and wrongs in their rival claims, ownership or occupation of this land has progressively changed hands, from Palestinian to Jewish, through a process of dispossession that was begun in 1918 or shortly after by the British. At the end of World War I, Palestine was handed over to Britain to govern by the League of Nations. A responsibility it discharged by ignoring the interests of the Palestinians, I think it's fair to say. Almost from day one, the British began allowing Jews, mostly from Europe, to immigrate to Palestine and to purchase as much land as they could when they arrived, with the acknowledged intention of helping Jews create a homeland in Palestine. These were undertakings enshrined in the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917. And they were at odds with the third Balfour undertaking to protect the civil and religious rights of the Arab inhabitants whose descendants may have lived there for centuries. Not that it mattered. Palestinians were simply not consulted about any of this. After almost 400,000 Jews had arrived in Palestine by 1936, Palestinian Arabs took to the streets. Over 5,000 Palestinians were killed by the British in disturbances that followed. While Jewish immigration was temporarily halted, it was from this platform that Israel got off the ground, as Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, attests. And it got off the ground very quickly following the Holocaust. Let's consider the scale of dispossession. If in 1947, Palestinians still owned 94% of the land of historic Palestine, by May 1948, when Israel was established, this had been whittled down to just 22%. In a matter of months, 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes and took refuge in 50 or so squalid refugee camps in neighbouring Arab countries. Over 6 million of the descendants remain there. Those who were not pushed out ended up in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as the last bits of Palestine they had any control over, and then not much. 20 years later, however, as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War, these two territories came to be occupied by Israel as well. They still are. Little wonder, perhaps, that Palestinians referred to this dispossession as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe in Arabic. While Palestinians may harbour thoughts of returning to their old homeland, they continue to be on the losing end of negotiations concerning them, which of course I haven't got time to go into. Suffice to say that the so-called roadmaps for peace that ostensibly promote Palestinian statehood, in which the UN and the great powers are sponsored over the years, tend to be impeded by roadblocks that are almost impossible to get around. Prime amongst these is Israel's refusal to return to the pre-1967 borders as the essential first step towards setting up a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And not far behind is Israel's reluctance, understandable I suppose, either to stop the construction of Jewish settlements, deemed illegal by the UN, or dismantle any of them, not least in the West Bank. According to Al Jazeera, there are literally well over 250 of these settlements, making the West Bank resemble a form of Swiss cheese, if you like, on the maps. None of this would seem to be of much concern to the US or the Australian government at the moment, for that matter. The Palestinians don't exist for them. They didn't for the British, who refer to them in the Balfour Declaration as the non-Jewish communities. And they never did for Israel. As Golda Meir told the world in 1969, when she was Prime Minister, there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. And this is the essential thing the world should understand. The one hope I see is that the Muslim world could be productively united by what is happening in Gaza and start putting pressure on the US and Israel to make the peace process work. I hope it's not too late. Despite everything, the two nations solution seems the best option for all concerned.
So, yes, I was going to speak about the war's implications for regional and global security. And first I'll examine human insecurity in Israel and Gaza, then the scope for interstate conflict in the Middle East, and the spread of unrest to countries further afield. I'll also explore the ramifications for global security posed by actors flouting international laws of conflict, as well as the diversion of attention from other pressing threats to humanity. Finally, like Howard has done, I will try to consider some key elements to a solution. We're here today out of grave concern for the terrible toll in human suffering wrought by the Hamas terrorist attack and hostage-taking of October 7, followed by the Israeli government's retaliation for 19 days since then by way of bombarding Gaza while cutting off the city's supply of food, water, power and medicine. It's exceedingly difficult to prevent a terrorist attack on soft civilian targets. Yet had there been a genuine commitment to negotiating, crafting and implementing a political compromise such as a two-state solution, we need not have come to this seeming abyss of despair. It's a failure of political leadership on both sides that culminated in Hamas's recourse to terrorism. The Netanyahu government is countering terrorism with violence that largely harms civilians, half of whom are children, and radicalises another generation of Palestinians. Israel's stated plan is to invade, occupy, and remain in Gaza as long as it takes to destroy Hamas and replace them with a moderate government. If this sounds familiar, that is because it is similar to the American response to 9/11. That embroiled many countries, including our own, in a 20-year war in Afghanistan with little to show at the end of it. Israel's current campaign in Gaza comes at great cost to its own people as well, as it has inflamed passions amongst other militant Muslim organisations, notably the Hezbollah group in Lebanon. After the Hamas terror attack, Israel had felt obliged to move tens of thousands of settlers to safety from the border region with Gaza. Since Hezbollah began bombing Israel from Lebanon, the state has moved another 200,000 citizens out of that border area. The number of internally displaced people in Gaza is even higher at over 1 million. There is potential for the war to escalate armed conflict between Israel and nearby hostile countries. Israel has bombed Lebanon and military targets in neighbouring Syria for aiding Hezbollah. There is particular concern over Iran, given that its supreme leader called for the complete destruction of Israel. Iran sponsors Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and the Houthi in Yemen, with finances and arms. This is a strategy that has been characterised by some as encirclement of Israel. Iran's other arch rival is Saudi Arabia. There is speculation that Iran encouraged the Hamas attack due to Saudi Arabia and Israel normalising relations earlier this year. There are factors which may constrain the outbreak of full-scale war between Israel and its neighbours. One is that Israel is a nuclear weapons state, the only one in the Middle East. This gives pause to any country contemplating outright war with Israel, including Iran. On the downside, it renders Israel more prone to excess in its military campaign in Gaza and impervious to international calls to exercise restraint. Israel's nuclear edge also gives Iran greater incentive to develop its own nuclear arsenal. Another factor to deter hostile neighbours from attacking Israel is its American allies' show of force with the recent introduction of 2 aircraft carriers to the region. In theory, the United Nations Security Council should apply a brake on warfare that kills and maims thousands of civilians in contravention of international laws on armed conflict. But its most powerful members cannot agree on a strong resolution. European states rejected a resolution by Russia because it failed to even mention Hamas. The US vetoed another resolution put up by Brazil and supported by a majority of 12 out of 15 because it condemned all acts of violence against civilians and called for a pause in bombing to allow humanitarian aid to Gaza. The US is convinced of Israel's expansively interpreted right to self-defence in the wake of the Hamas terrorist attack. Within and beyond the Middle East, there is a security threat to other countries posed by social unrest, division, and the prospect of communal violence between those with allegiances on opposing sides of the conflict. Worse still is the possibility of terrorist acts undertaken by lone wolves or reactivated extremist cells who are enraged by the unprecedented extent of civilian casualties in the Israel-Palestine war. Intelligence agencies will need to be hyper-vigilant to detect and prevent such plots, particularly difficult with lone wolves. In addition, it behooves political and religious leaders in all countries to speak in measured tones and not do anything that might incite such violence. Another threat to global security, posed by the spectre of an escalating armed conflict in the Middle East, is the reliable supply and affordable price of oil. Iran is a major source of oil, and it can readily block the narrow Straits of Hormuz through which many of the world's oil tankers travel. This is a real concern to an economy like that of Australia that is so dependent on imported oil and only has a 30-day reserve if the supply is cut off altogether. The federal government has been aware of this strategic vulnerability for many years but done nothing to rectify it. Finally, Russia's savage war on Ukraine and now this Israel-Palestine war are diverting attention from urgent action needed to tackle the existential threat of climate change. This year we face the hottest year on the planet in 100,000 years. Summer across the world has been punctuated by bushfires, and now we're facing another such season in Australia. But world leaders are preoccupied and divided politically by these armed conflicts that prevent vital international cooperation on climate change. Given the limitations of the UN Security Council, the momentum for humanitarian access and a negotiated peace may need to shift to the United Nations General Assembly and/or regional coalitions. We also need the media to demonstrate that the eyes of the world are on all parties to this conflict, impartially scrutinising and documenting their every move. This may both deter excesses and provide evidence for later prosecutions. There's also an important role for NGOs and civil society more broadly, including folks such as your good selves, to maintain the pressure for a peaceful outcome. Both Israeli and Palestinian peoples are focused on their rights to land, to sovereignty, national identity, and indeed their legitimate right to exist. The ambitions of these two people must be incorporated into any lasting solution. Thank you.
I can barely express what it seems like to try and make sense of such an awful tragedy that's going on in our own time, with many thousands of people being destroyed on both sides of this conflict, which seems to have no reconciliation in sight at this stage. My concern, however, is to begin by remarking on the very, very quick appearance of Joe Biden in Israel when the war was getting underway. Remarkable that a person like that, who is cosseted all the time and has to be carefully taken here and there and greater preparations made for his movement, suddenly appears in Israel and shakes the hand of Netanyahu, and America is full behind you. I think Biden's appearance was as much to do with domestic politics as it was to do with approval that he wanted to give to Israel at the time. There's huge support for Israel in the United States. Well, at least Biden seems to have stalled the ground invasion of Gaza for some time at least. And Karin reminds me that, of course, one of his great concerns would be the number of Americans who are being held hostage at this time. Amongst the Americans, there's this very strong appeal to ancient scripture about what's going on in Palestine and Israel. The promised land in ancient times was given to Abraham, and it was inherited by his sons Jacob, who bore the other name of Israel, and Ishmael. And Ishmael is claimed to be in the ancestry of Muhammad. The tribes of Moab and Sheba and Ammonites were all set to live peacefully with the tribes of Israel in the same territory. In the book of Deuteronomy, shared by Christians and Jews together, God will not give Israel any of the lands that had been given to the other branches of Abraham's family. So there was, according to these ancient approaches, a sharing of the territory. Now, a lot of people these days claim that these promises of God exist for all time, and that results in this tremendous impasse, because both sides have got this claim to God's approval and God's provision of territory for them. Now, where the borderlines occur is very much obviously under dispute. Muslims claim a great heritage in the city of Jerusalem, just as the Jews do, because that was the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as new capital of Israel and putting his consulate there was indeed very provocative to the Muslims. But he, I think, had this huge following from what are called the Christian Zionists in the United States. There's a huge claim by the so-called evangelical Christians in the United States that Israel is central to the fulfilment of the end times. Jesus shall return to Israel to rule the earth. It gets to be quite fanatical. One TV evangelist, the very, very wealthy John Hagee, is paradoxically anti-Semite in his personal approaches, but boisterously pro-Israel. Quite a paradox. The push to establish a central homeland for the Jews has got a very long history because it goes way back to the growth of the Puritans. Some of the great advocates included some of Oliver Cromwell's henchmen in his great army. Also a notable minister in Massachusetts, John Cotton. Settling the Jews in Israel would somehow speed up the second coming because Christ had to return to Israel to rule the world. Now, during the Enlightenment, such great figures as the scientist Isaac Newton and the philosopher Baruch Spinoza were supporters of this homeland for Israel. In that same era, Charles Wesley, who wrote something like 9,000 hymns, actually produced some doggerel on this very subject. And one of the verses says, "Send then thy servants forth to call the Hebrews home, from west and east and south and north, let all the wanderers come. Where'er in lands unknown the fugitives remain, bid every creature help them on the holy mount to gain." So there's this swelling idea of finding the home for the wandering Jews. The second president of the United States, John Adams, wished the Jews an independent nation and believed that it would make them convert to Unitarian Christians once they got there. There's also some doggerel from Herman Melville of Moby Dick fame. He says, "With seed and tillage help renew, help reinstate the Holy Land." There was a strong Christian belief behind the famous Balfour Declaration in 1917, where there was a bias towards this approach for Israel. Of the Christian right, this very wild evangelist fellow called Jerry Falwell, who was the basis behind what was called the moral majority, made this sort of statement: to stand up against Israel is to stand against God. Much Christian right thinking is actually a kind of reflex. It's an instinctual response. I remember so clearly a vox pop that was being held during the time of the attacks on the Congress. And there was a young lady being interviewed. He said, "What's your position?" The interviewer said. And she came out flashing and she had it all pat. "I am pro-God, pro-life, pro-gun, pro-Trump." That's all she said. There seemed to be some contradictions in there, especially with gun next to life. The people who call for Jews to return to Israel have as a condition that they convert to Christianity once they get there, before Jesus can come. So I think not too many Jews are very happy about the support they get from the Christian right, but it is a very big phenomenon in American politics. Once the General Assembly of the National Council of Churches in the United States said that the Christian right stand downgraded the Jews themselves as they were pawns in the end of earth scheme. It also downgraded Muslims because they were held to be subordinate to the rights of Jews. And it inhibited interfaith dialogue because it saw the world as simply divided. There is this weird claim that all the verses of the Bible exist as political instructions for today. Well, a chap called Joel Rosenberg, who is a Christian, wrote this just last Wednesday. Psalm 83 predicted the Israel-Gaza war. It reads like today's headlines, he claims. It describes enemies who lay crafty plans against your people. Quote from the Psalm. Verse 4 says, the enemies say, "Come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more." And verses 6 to 8 say, where the enemies of Israel live, the Ishmaelites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, etc. These are the enemies of Israel. And he's trying to say, and the psalm is saying, this is exactly what's happening right now, is some miraculous prediction. exactly the people, the ones that Deuteronomy said Israel should live within peace. And Philistia was one of those mentioned, and that, Rosenberg says, is the Gaza Strip, place that held the former Philistines, enemies of Israel. He says the psalmist asked God to destroy the enemies, like whirling dust, like chaff before the wind. My tragic end is that we've just seen too much of that whirling dust over a very ancient and honoured land.
I want to start by asking you to do a little imagination. You can shut your eyes or not, as you prefer. But I'd like you to think of a grandmother holding her dead grandchild. I saw this happen once in Cowra, but I'm asking you to imagine that this is happening in the Middle East. There is the grandmother, and she's crying quietly, and she's holding a dead grandchild. I wish to raise that imagination to make the absolute point that every human life is of equal value. And that is the basic thought behind the acceptance of people's human rights, that every life is of equal value. And sadly, in the context of the Middle East, there are groups that simply do not accept that. And when you're listening to the news, you probably think it's true because it sounds rational, and it is true, that under international law, it's illegal to do many things which are happening, which including the practice of assassination, the targeting of civilians, going beyond proportionality in actual fighting, which means whoever is in charge of the orders that are given to the troops, and the troops going into battle with an awareness of what the rules of war are, and many modern armies spend quite a lot of their time actually practicing with videos so that they know, could I shoot in this circumstance when there is a child between me and the person who's just been trying to shoot me? So certainly they know what the rules are. Equally, and this is a very important consideration in the current situation, it is illegal to impose group punishment. For those of you who know something about the history of World War II, some of these lists are beginning to sound terribly familiar. These were the things that the Nazis did, and many Australian soldiers thought they were going to war to stop anybody doing them again, to stop anybody doing them again. Obviously, genocide is another thing which is absolutely illegal under international law. For example, President al-Bashir of Sudan, they haven't persuaded him to give himself up yet, but he is due to be tried for genocide against his own people in Sudan. By the same token, we can imagine heads of other governments who would be liable to the same punishment. I should, of course, point out that the Americans are not signatory to the Rome Statute, which establishes the International Criminal Court, for the precise reason that they could see they would be at risk were they to sign. I should also make the point that you can have genocide by attrition. If you starve a population to death, that is genocide by attrition. If you deny them water, if you deny them the basic necessities of life, medicine, etc., that is also genocide by attrition, and that is part of what General al-Bashir would be tried for. I've mentioned that we should think back, perhaps, to examples from World War II. One obvious example that we might think of is the Warsaw Ghetto. It has become quite common to say that the Gaza Strip is the world's largest prison camp. But I would also say that it is equivalent to the Warsaw Ghetto. November 1940, 380,000 Jews were sealed inside the Warsaw Ghetto, and over 80,000 died of starvation and disease. By January 1942, deportation of the Jews to the death camps began. Bear in mind that example that one had thought everybody in the world would consider unacceptable. I was asked to say something about refugees from Gaza. If you've been listening to the news, you've probably noticed that UNRWA, which is the UN Relief and Works Agency, gets a lot of mention in terms of UN agencies that are trying to assist the population of Gaza. The reason why it is UNRWA and not the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is precisely a verbal debate over whether the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip are refugees or not. So they are actually dealt with by a separate agency, and if you ever see statistics for how many refugees there are around the world, they will not actually include the population of the Gaza Strip, who are counted separately. The whole question of the status of those who live in Gaza, those who live in refugee camps, whose children have been born in those refugee camps, in some cases whose grandchildren have been born in those refugee camps. You might wonder why they don't leave. It is evident to most people that there is going to be an invasion by the Israeli state. The answer is a terribly tragic one. Were the Rafah crossing to be open to Egypt, people will not leave because they know they would not be allowed back in. So they won't leave because they won't be allowed back, even when they are being bombed 3-4 times a day. At the moment, Egypt would not let them in. Egypt won't let them in because there's an election due early next year in Egypt, and the Egyptian president knows very well that allowing in a whole lot of refugees from the Gaza Strip would not be a popular thing in Egypt. The last thing I have to talk about is the possible solutions. And I'm going to surprise you, possibly. I have a class of students, the majority of whom are Muslims. And as you can understand, they are very, very upset by what is happening. In fact, when I first said I would like to discuss Israel-Palestine with them, they said no. We are so upset that we just can't bear to think about it. They then started talking. They said, all right, the first thing we want to know is, what do the Israelis want? What are they going to do when they have bombed the shit out of Gaza? Clearly, what the Israelis really want is that the people should leave into Egypt if Egypt would have them, or whatever. It seems a perfectly fair question to ask Israel, okay, you go in there, then what? Some in the Israeli military talk of getting rid of Hamas. This is a very strange view. If you killed somebody, their brother, their nephew, whoever, is going to be converted to joining Hamas. The notion that you can get rid of them, it's just insane. I've only actually personally met one suicide bomber. I worked with a former suicide bomber at the United Nations, and she had been involved in the French war in Algeria, and she had become a suicide bomber trying to kill the French precisely because the French had killed 3 of her brothers. You can just imagine the motivation is going to be exactly the same in the Gaza Strip. The tragedy is that Israel doesn't really seem to have thought about what they're going to do, however many people they manage to kill in the Gaza Strip. What then? It's very ironic that the reason why Hamas is powerful in the Gaza Strip is precisely because Fatah, the other group which plays a significant role in the West Bank, the Israelis didn't like them and they thought that they could do more to handle Hamas. Can we envisage a UN force? I used to spend quite a bit of my time as a diplomat at the United Nations. My impression is it is simply not possible now to envisage a UN force going in and managing the Gaza Strip, given the current roles being played by Russia and China. Maybe a European force. Would it be possible to get a group of European nations, preferably from among the Nordic countries, We can think about parallels from the former Yugoslavia. I don't think it would be possible to have an Arab force, although I noted that Karin was making quite a lot of possible assumptions about the American government, and as a former diplomat, I know perfectly well what they say in public and what they say behindhand. They've been putting a lot of pressure on Israel. They just don't do it in public for very good domestic political reasons. All of this, if it is ever negotiated, will be negotiated with the Americans playing a very significant role, whatever the chosen decision is, because the Americans are the one people who can tell the Israelis, don't do that. I was very heavily involved with the liberation movements in South Africa. I always say to myself, what would Mandela do? Because of a very, very diplomatic career. I've actually been kissed by both Mandela and, more unlikely, Yasser Arafat. We don't think of the Gaza Strip as having universities, but it does. We should look more at what they can do. The one thing that I know that old men in the Gaza Strip and old men in Israel share is a passion for backgammon. Is there any way we can think of using this? Thank you.
So my task is to offer an explanation of Australia's political response to the latest conflict and violence between Palestine and Israel. The Australia in question is the Australian political class, the government, the opposition, parliamentarians more broadly, the media, and other shapers of opinion. One possible explanation of the situation we see before us is to note the stance of the United States and then note the propensity of most Australian politicians to be in lockstep with the US, to say, there you are, and sit back down again. But I promised Karin I would speak for 10 minutes and perhaps the subject could do with a little bit more exploration. If we are to pull it apart a little, we might choose to begin with the concerning tendency of Australian foreign policy being determined less by first principles and internationally accepted standards and more by domestic political considerations. And this trend is especially concerning when the domestic considerations are base. An example of how skewed the political situation is can be seen on 17 October when first-term Labor Senator Fatima Payman condemned the killing of innocent civilians on both sides. She added, the price tag of Israel's right to defend itself cannot be the destruction of Palestine. Unfortunately, the latter sentiment didn't make it into the motion passed on 18 October, which remained intentionally silent on the bombing of Palestinian civilians. Foreign Minister Penny Wong posted a comment on 18 October declaring, quote, the scenes from the explosion at Gaza City Hospital are deeply distressing, end of quote. But the government on the same day once again voted against a Greens amendment calling for an end to the invasion of Gaza. The ALP, it seems, is more intent to differentiate itself from the Greens than the coalition on this matter, as on so many others. Any explanation of the principal drivers of Australia's obsequiousness to the Israel and US governments would have to observe the endless rightward shift of the parliamentary ALP in general terms, as well as its specific stance towards the Israel-Palestine conflict. The ALP's right was always coloured, if not dominated, by a pro-Israel stance, although there have been notable exceptions over time, such as Bob Carr. And the left became half-hearted from the 1980s onwards. Even noting these encroaching and significant limitations in recent decades, some nuance existed in the expression of ALP policy, at least until about 2020, if one was prepared to look carefully enough. All this comes on the back of the ALP's recent biennial conference held in August this year, which looked at changing the language used in describing the dispute. At one point, it was mooted that Israel's settlements would be described as illegal and the territories as occupied, but this was headed off by Penny Wong, to offer, supposedly as a trade, as a good deal, what is essentially the status quo, the right of Israel and Palestine to exist as two states, and call on the Australian government, but with no timeline attached, to recognise Palestine as a state. When we turn to the media, we're no less frustrated. The publisher Louise Adler, believing it to be in the public interest to publish an evidence-based account of the challenges the media confront in reporting on the region, commissioned John Lyons to write Dateline Jerusalem, Journalism's Toughest Assignment, which was published in 2021. Lyons is a veteran newspaper editor who spent 6 years as a foreign correspondent in Israel and is now Global Affairs Editor at the ABC. He's the chap you see doing the reporting at the moment from the region. The task was to examine the impoverished reporting on the Middle East, and in his book, 23 editors, senior journalists and reporters confirmed on the record that the problem is the Israel lobby. I haven't read Lyons' acclaimed book, so I'm not aware of whether it contains a linguistic analysis of the mainstream media's description of events as they affect respective sides in the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. But there is a 2018 study of US media on the same matter, which shows a deep decline in the instances of the word occupation in headlines, and that Israeli sources are 2.5 times more likely to be quoted than Palestinian sources. Apart from the Washington Post, Israel-focused headlines were more positive in all publications in the US. There's also the distinguished Professor of Law Ben Saul, who's published hundreds of op-eds over 20 years, who couldn't get an op-ed published anywhere in early 2022 when he wrote in support of the pro-Palestine boycott of the Sydney Festival. Even if the powerful lobby did not exist, I'm afraid to say, one is not very confident that the Australian media's coverage would be adequate, given its understanding of what constitutes balance. As we've just seen in the recent referendum coverage, Australian journalists seem absolutely incapable or unwilling to tutor themselves in the most basic understanding of objectivity, thinking it means giving equal space to facts alongside arrant nonsense. Of course, I haven't said anything yet about the notion of Christian Zionism, and this notion of Christian Zionism does exert a not insignificant influence in the Liberal Party in looking for the fulfilment of biblical prophecy, including the return of Jews to their homeland. Christian Zionists set the well-being of Israel as a political goal to the exclusion of all other goals. The problem arises when other people's rights are denied, when the Arab world replaces the Soviet Union as the major force of evil, because Christian Zionists have this tendency to see the world as a struggle between good and evil. In this ideologically charged atmosphere, it seems that the last thing that will receive attention to resolve the conflict are the root causes of the conflict, which are essentially material. But here we see the problem in placing any hope that the ALP government will do anything that involves addressing the root causes, because it gave up addressing root causes across many a policy area, foreign or domestic, long ago. Henry John Temple, better known as Lord Palmerston, is sometimes quoted in international relations circles to the effect that a country has no eternal allies and no perpetual enemies, just eternal and perpetual interests. But as can be seen in so many areas of foreign policy, Australia has steadily moved away from any stance based on articulating its own interests, much less pursuing them, let alone pursuing any higher ideal.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to our panel. Now, what we're going to do for the rest of the evening, we'll have a musical, I don't think the word interlude is probably the appropriate term. Robert Jackson from New England Conservatorium of Music, cellist and teacher, is going to play a piece by the famous Catalonian cellist Pablo Casals, Lament for Peace, which I believe is based upon a Catalonian folk song.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to introduce my colleague Dr. Manley, who's the resident accompanist here at NECOM. He'll be accompanying me this evening. So please give him a hand. And the piece we're about to play is the Song of the Birds. Casals played it in front of the UN for a very different struggle back in the 50s to recognise his homeland. And the words that the birds sing in the song are peace, peace, peace. So I hope you enjoy it.